the church. The church. What's the church?
People.
People is the church. Yeah. Church is one of these words that can endure all kinds of meanings. We talk about going to church, and we probably mean going to worship, the divine service. We talk about the church burned down. We mean a building. We might talk about the church should do more for poor people, and we probably mean the institution. Or we can say that the church is worshiping God, and we're talking about then probably this institution of believers all over the world. Okay? So the church can mean all these kinds of different things. We are primarily interested, when we talk about the church, is we are interested in the gathering of believers in all places, in all times. And we typically will divide the church in two categories, and I mentioned those earlier. We have the church militant, and we have the church triumphant. And the church militant is the church still at battle, military, at war. And who are we at war with? Well, Satan, the world, our own flesh, the world, the church at war. We're going to it. We're fighting. The church militant is you and me and everybody else who's still living and breathing. That's the church militant. All believers who are still alive. That's the church militant. And it extends in all places and all times, across borders and across ethnic divisions. The church triumphant, this is the church at rest. Believers, basically, who are already in the anteroom of the banquet hall in heaven. Okay? All right. The quotes, all right? Okay? So, the church triumphant. So, Grandpa George was a great believer. Died. He's part of the church triumphant. That's just a good way to talk about it. I found one of the best ways to make funeral announcements talking about somebody joining the church triumphant. It's a nice way to think about it. So they're still part of the church. They're still with us. They've just taken their place, left the church militant to the church triumphant. They're still part of the church. They're still here with us. And these are both part of the communion of saints, as John was pointing out earlier. That's exactly right. Both of these are in the community of saints, part of that. Now, the church in this world has kind of like two component parts. Traditionally, we will talk about the invisible church and the visible church. Dr. Kolb's a little reluctant to endorse that and doesn't like it quite so much. But the idea here is what we're getting at is the invisible church would be the true believers. And it's invisible because you can't look at anybody and know if he's really a believer in Christ. Maybe he's just a hypocrite and playing a game. You don't know. In the visible church, well, that is the outward manifestation of the church. So you have Trinity Lutheran Church. Well, there's a church. Who's in that church? Well, I can hand you the roster. And here's the roster of 500 names. Here's the 200 who are active. And here's the other 300. And that's our church. Just to be a little facetious, right? All right? So that's the outward manifestation. In that visible church of those 500 names on the roster there at Trinity Lutheran Church, how many are members of the invisible church?
We don't know.
We don't know. Maybe all of them, maybe not. There might be some people who aren't even part of that. And it's even possible that you might have somebody who is part of the invisible church who's not part of a visible church. Pretty rare, but theoretically it's possible. Say, for example, you might have a believer in Saudi Arabia who has no church to which they can go, and they haven't found a fellowship of believers even though they're looking for it, but they really do believe in Christ. That's possible. It's possible. Like I said, pretty rare, but possible. So these do correspond, but they don't overlap neatly right on top of each other. All right? The other thing we recognize with the church is that the church does include all true believers, not just Lutheran. And you would think after my little spiel about Lord's Supper and the importance of unity that, well, only Lutherans are in heaven. No, come on. I don't believe that. And I don't think any Lutheran worth his salt believes that. And I'm tired of people saying, oh, you think you're the ones going to heaven. No, we don't. And anybody who is hearing the gospel and living the gospel and knows salvation through faith in Jesus Christ alone, that's what it's all about. In fact, if you get right down to it, and for our little guy up there, our body, what do you have to be saved? Well, I would say it probably boils down to two things that are really important. Salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ alone, and recognizing the Trinity. Those are the things you got to have. Everything else is nice, but that's what you got to have. And if a person has those two things, yeah, they're a brother in Christ, even if they are a pin-headed Baptist or a tradition-loving Roman Catholic. You know, they're a brother in Christ if those two things are there, and we recognize that, and we are able to embrace that and appreciate that and see the truth in that. But we also recognize that we do have an obligation for doctrinal teaching and keeping things right and teaching things the right way. And so that's why we don't just say, hey, our doctrinal differences don't matter, don't worry about it. No, they do matter, and we do want to try to deal with these things. But even as we're dealing with them, we recognize, yeah, you're still a brother in Christ, and we'll see each other in heaven someday, and we'll get this all straightened out, and you'll see how wrong you were, and we'll be okay. It's just a matter of time. You know, but so we recognize that we're not so close-minded that we're the only ones who are right. We don't think that at all. What are the marks of the church then? How do you know when you've got a real church or a false church? The marks of the church, people have offered different descriptions of these, but the marks of the church, really there's just two of them. The first one is that the gospel is proclaimed. Because if the gospel is not being proclaimed, you can't possibly have a church. And the second criteria is that the sacraments are being practiced. So it comes down to the means of grace are there. You've got word and you've got sacrament. That's what's making the church work. So the gospel is correctly proclaimed, and the sacrament is properly administered and practiced, and that's where you got the church. No gospel, no church. No sacraments, no church. All right, so who's in the church? Well, the true believers. And so if I have somebody who confesses to me and professes to be a believer in Christ, is he part of the church? Yeah, I take him at face value. That's all I can do. I take the profession, and I don't doubt it, and I treat him as a believer in Christ. And I proclaim the gospel to him. So when somebody confesses to me and seeks forgiveness, and I have no reason to doubt his confession, even though I might think he's not sincere, I take him at his words, and I treat him like a believer. That's what you do. That's how we function within the church. So profession is adequate to recognize who's in the church. Now, as I mentioned, Kolb wasn't really fond of invisible, visible, because invisible starts to kind of give the idea of intangible or not real or something, and somehow not being substantial. He prefers the terminology, and I think this is kind of good, of hidden over against revealed. And this helps us too, because sometimes we talk about the visible church, and we start to kind of denigrate that like it really doesn't matter. But it does. And so the hidden and revealed, I think, help us a little better here. Hidden reminds us that ultimately who is a true believer is hidden from our eyes. God knows that. We can't really know that. So that's hidden. But what is revealed is the church in action. The church proclaiming the gospel. The church administering the sacraments. The church burying its dead and baptizing its young. The church functioning as the church. That's where we see the church in action revealed. So this division tends to think invisible, that's the real thing. Visible, that's not the real church. That's wrong. The hidden church is true, the church, but so is the revealed church, where God is revealing himself, and he's at work, and he's in action. And that is the church doing its thing. So the church is this gathering of believers carrying out the work of God, serving God. And the church then calls people to serve it. And that's where the ministry fits in. The office of the ministry. The office of the ministry exists at God's will. And the purpose is simply to make sure that the church is doing its job and to serve the church in the job. And what is the church's job? Proclaim the gospel. That's what the church does. So the church is called to do. In fact, the church's number one job, this is without any doubt, is to proclaim the gospel. Everything else is secondary. Soup kitchen, that's fine. That's secondary. Proclaim the gospel, that's number one. Go build a house, Habitat for Humanity, fine. That's secondary. Proclaiming the gospel, that's job number one. You know, having an outreach event, we're going to do blood pressure screening. Fine, have fun doing it. But that's not what the gospel is, what church is all about. We're here to proclaim the gospel. That's job number one. Let's not ever forget, number one task, to declare the gospel. The fact is, there are lots of institutions in this world to which people can belong, but there's only one that's proclaiming the gospel, and that's the church. And if the church fails in that task, no one else is going to do it. A lot of churches these days seem to be confused about this, and they get all caught up trying to meet people's needs. They want to be a place that provides fellowship and a place where they can belong. But bars can do that really well. Probably better. Because at a bar, they're not going to ever challenge your behavior. They're just going to let you be you, and they don't care. And so if I want to just go somewhere where everybody knows my name, well, Cheers will do the job just fine, thank you. Or the local bowling alley. I don't need to go to church. And when churches start trying to get into the business of meeting the need of people belonging, we're going to lose every time. Because the bar and the bowling alley will do it better. Our job is not making people feel like they belong. Our job is to proclaim the gospel. Now, along the way, fellowship, that happens, sure. But that's not the objective. The objective is the proclamation of the gospel, declaring the absolution of sinners. That's what we're here for. And no one else is doing that. So we've got to make sure we do that well. And don't ever drop that ball. So I get a little tired of people talking about the church needs to be even better at reaching out to people and making people feel welcome. Yeah, I suppose. That's secondary, though. That's all secondary. So we don't need to be in the business of marketing and being people-friendly. That's not really our task. Our task is to be the place that proclaims Christ and gives the absolution. So that's what we do. All right. Part of then, another aspect of this, and we just need to talk about this because it fits in here, and this whole idea of proclaiming the gospel, is the idea of the